Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about reaction tables in old D&D. I believe Holmes D&D has them, and of course, basic D&D Moldvay has them. Reaction tables, and I love reaction tables. 2d6, very simple chart modified by character's charisma. If you're like me as a GM or DM, sometimes you would modify it by circumstances. If the players outnumber the enemies, or if the characters have something, you can modify beyond charisma, right? So there's circumstantial modifiers, those kind of things. But I love it, and so when I run your old OSR games that have a reaction table in them, um, I will roll a reaction check for everything. It doesn't have to be an intelligent, rational, civilized creature. It can be a bear, because very often a bear doesn't want any more to do. It's not necessarily aggressive and doesn't want any more to do with, the you than you want to do with it. But I always modify it by the leading character's charisma score. So if Joe's the fighter and he's leading the party through the woods and they stumble out and there's no surprise and they stumble out, well, even if there is surprise, you can make a reaction check. Generally, I'll roll a reaction table no matter what, surprise or no, because again, you can surprise a bear and it not necessarily, you could spook it in a way like a morale check, right? Or the bear ultimately could be as curious about you as you are about it, and move on depending on your right. So what it does is it takes some of those decisions out of my hands, and it makes the game more organic in the sense that it's again, I'm not making a GM fiat decision about how everything reacts to the players. I mean, obviously, if the players are infiltrating a place that obviously they would not want strangers in, like a fort or the goblin caves or something, you can still make a reaction check to see how a group of goblins immediately responds, especially if, say, goblins are outnumbered or again are surprised or something like that. So for me, part of Moldvay's magic for me was the reaction tables. Is reaction tables. There's a couple of things that make basic Moldvay, or Old School Essentials, which is the remastered version, for me, still ideal as the go-to old D20 fantasy game. That is reaction tables, and how we modify those with charisma of the characters. Also, the saving check, right? The save versus death, save versus poison, save versus, right? We had a great example the other night. We had a character fail a dex check and fall, and he tumbled, and there would be damage to be taken. That would have been a good time to do a save versus death to half damage. If the save is made, the damage is halved, right? So I love the save as certainly for environmental damage, for trap damage. Players very often, they step on a trap inadvertently. It's not necessarily, it's one of those things where uh, you leave it up to chance with the save anyway, so to speak. But generally, that save either saves you completely or would half the damage type of thing. So these are the kind of things I love about the old D20 basic Dungeons and Dragons. These types of tools and the way we can use them um, in game, right? So as a kid, we'd always do attribute checks. Obviously, we've talked about this before. Attribute checks when a situation would arise, like climbing without a rope or jumping a pit, right? What's happened is, as an adult, I've stopped doing attribute checks because they're static. I do a save versus modified by an attribute score. So let's say someone needs to make the jump from point A to point B. It would be a save dex check. They would do a save versus whatever, death or dragon's breath, something it's imminent danger if they fail, and modify that save by their dexterity modifier. So we have, and the reason I like that is as we level up in old D&D, our saves improve, which is a representation of how we as heroes improve, we as adventurers improve. So our save gets better. Our dexterity attribute never changes, but let's say I've got a thief with a +2 dex. I get to add that bonus +2 dex to any save when I'm jumping or falling or those types of things. So I like to use a save modified by the attribute modifier, right? For attribute checks as opposed to roll under decks. I mean, but roll under decks works. But these are things that again, all GMs kind of bring their own thumbprint to how they use the mechanics or how they what their philosophy is and how the game functions on behalf of the players, or how the game functions in a fair or whatever a interesting way. There's no right or wrong, obviously, but reaction tables for me are paramount, and I use them in Wandering Monsters. Just because a bear stumbles across your camp in the middle of the night doesn't mean the bear is going to attack. Bear doesn't want to be wounded or killed anymore, right, than the adventurers do, those kind of things. Now, obviously, monsters might be out looking or hunting or hungry. A bear might be hungry. Well, the reaction check would tell me the bear's disposition, right? So I don't have to decide if the bear is just aggressive, like rabid, or dangerous. If the bear were to react negatively and it would lead to an attack, then I can then it makes total sense for me to understand the bear is hungry, starving, or sick, right, or vicious for some reason. But that also then impacts morale checks for the bear if it's winning or losing a combat or a attack outnumbered by players, right? Those kind of things. So it just made Moldvay, and again, unfair because it's the only real game outside of Holmes that I even had really played. But it just still, and I harken back when I look at the books, when I play OSC, I can't help but think that that basic expert version of D&D was damn near perfect in many, many ways. And for me, perfect anyway, especially as a DM, a dungeon master. As a player, of course, I've enjoyed it immensely in all kinds of various ways, whether it was basic fantasy or whether it was Lamentations of the Flame Princess, whether it was other OSRs that we've used, Sword and Wizardry, Continue Light, etc., etc., etc. So, but I want to talk about this because there were tools and rules for old D&D. We just didn't necessarily, from table to table around the neighborhood or around the community, every DM was different. Maybe didn't use them or maybe didn't use them the same way. I only recently realized I should be rolling for feet distant from the enemy. And I had never done that. I'd never really paid attention to that rule ever in all of my days of Moldvay D&D or basic D&D, and only came to recognize that particular rule about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when someone pointed out, you roll the distance from the target. So we know how far we are from melee we are. And I would just narrate when they'd enter a room, if the room was so big, where they naturally were in the cavern. So if it was a cavern that was 30 by 40, I would just narrate when they entered the cavern. These goblins on the other side of the cavern coming into the cavern, they're about 40 feet away, right? So I would just use an organic kind of assessment of where might these goblins be in the room, in the cavern, in the hallway, so to speak. But to know that was there and I never used it was a kind of a wide eye opening, right? So these are what I mean by consistency, right? We don't always every DM does things purposely differently, and some DMs just don't do it at all because they aren't aware of it or they're not interested in it or it's not something that they are concerned with. But it's fascinating how every time I look and I flip through the Moldvay book and I break down Moldvay and I break down why it uh, is so beloved, I think, still by guys from my generation in particular. I don't know how many younger generation had a chance to discover Moldvay and go back and play it with individuals. They got a different version of D&D. Mincer, for the guys just behind me, it was Mincer, and then of course AD&D and what else came on beyond that, right? And then so I often wonder how often they get to enjoy that particular version of D&D. Again, hopefully Old School Essentials is bringing a whole new generation to this version of D20 D&D. Fantastic game. And I talk about this because I'm enjoying the hell out of our Joff campaigns with Todd and Dell and David and John and all the guys, and constantly reminded of how flexible and how useful as a rule set it is. We talked a little bit the other day, post session. We had a session we had to abort due to illness, but we hung around having a chat afterwards. We talked a little bit about obviously competency in D&D, and that's the toughest thing to get over as a player with a first, second, third level character is how competent your character is in doing things, whether it is sneaking in shadows, picking locks, or whether it is just melee or firing an arrow. It can be very difficult to understand the relationship to your level one character and how they are failing in the world versus success. And some of that comes down to simply narrating it differently, right? You know how the arrow misses might have nothing to do with your failed roll so much as it has to do with the circumstances in which your level one character is firing an arrow into the into at the creatures that are maybe adroit enough to avoid it being they use a shield. So how we narrate the failure of the PC could also be narrating how they're more adroit, their HD, their armor class worked. Therefore, they deflect the arrow away, or therefore they dodge the arrow, or it hits in their armor and just doesn't penetrate the armor. So failing your roll doesn't mean your arrow misses wildly. It means you haven't affected the goblin in a actual way. It doesn't mean you didn't hit the goblin. It doesn't mean it just means you didn't affect the goblin. So how we narrate that or how we view that failure could also make for a more organic, more natural reflection of how we're not incompetent. They're just as competent as we are. The goblins are just as competent as we are at this point, right? And so these are the things that I think we can affect via GMing, right? How we GM the thing, how we narrate the thing, how we describe the goblin's armor, getting the job done. Because when you make a roll against their armor class and you fail, it's not so much your character failed as their armor class worked, their armor worked, their ability to avoid the blow or the fatigue or however you want to look at hit points. That is as valid as your failing to hit them, right? And over the course of a session or the course of a module or the course of a campaign, those become rich narrative moments that don't portray your character as incompetent, but portray the opponent as dangerous, right? Level one characters running into level one or level HD and a half creatures, you may be overwhelmed by the kobolds, or the kobolds are very quick, and you're just not yet you're just not yet as strong. So I've often started characters at level 3, full hit points. So they're also a little more squishy when we begin level 1 to 3 modules, which I don't run modules, but I'll run sessions where I recognize we're dealing with levels 1 to 3 party members. So I try to keep the Wandering Monster tables in that range. I try to keep the threats that are relevant to level 1 to 3 party. That doesn't mean they wouldn't run across something that was really above their heads, or a number of creatures that are in their heads. And again, Moldvay, you don't just roll for the creature, you roll to see how many you run into, and this can be overwhelming odds for a group. And again, it's not that you're not competent as a warrior or competent as a magic user. It is their limitations, but they can be seen so much as you're not incompetent, you are over your the challenge is it's overwhelming odds versus competency, right? But hard to do when you fail a pick locks check, right? To narrate, this lock, but you can narrate this lock is just you've just never seen a lock like this. So you're messing around with, you just can't seem to trigger the mechanism. It's kind of above your head right now, right? Because you're level 1 thief, right? It might make it easier for players to handle the narrative of failure, right? The idea that you aren't so incompetent, you're just not. You haven't seen a lock like this before. That explains why you failed, right? You failed, but it's because the lock is just out of your experience level, right? So anyway, there's all kinds of ways to kind of navigate that terrain. So I'm enjoying the heck out of OSC and Joth. I have slowly, in the last few months, as I have been away and as I have evaluated, what I've been doing over the last few years in gaming, and including designing my own game and enjoying running it and enjoying playing in that, enjoying the Joth campaigns and trying some new games, Simba Room, and some of the stuff I've run for my local group, which have almost all been OSRs, generally Sword and Wizardry, White Box, etc. the more I find myself very, very, very content with this mechanism of rules, how we narrate and how we play role playing in this mechanism of rules, this rule book, these rules is not limited by the rules themselves, right? We can have remarkable characters that will have remarkable adventures utilizing a rule set that has some fundamental strategy and tactical effects, which make it, which structure it to some degree. And I find as I'm now 53 and have enjoyed all kinds of gaming, I find myself nestled in right at home with old Moldvay D&D OSE. So pretty cool. Magic is the thing, right? Magic has always been a bit of a problem because it is literal in D&D, right? They can literally affect the world. Sometimes there's a save for the enemy, sometimes, and they generally don't have to do anything to successfully utilize the magic, which is a nice benefit for the player if once they have the spell, right? That ensures that there's competency for the magic user, right? So we talk about how competent the magic user is. Yes, but they didn't have to make any roll to succeed at the magic. So I only have one spell at level 1, but it's guaranteed to work unless they make a save, unless they have a save. Sleep is a fine example. I can cast it without question, and they have no save versus sleep. Now, sleep may not get all of them if it's 20 goblins. It may only knock out 8 of the goblins, but there is competency there. It's just you're limited in how much power to draw upon, so to speak. So anyway, how we look at this stuff, how we play it, how we narrate it, how we evaluate how the rules affect our character and how the character is, how the world is affected by their success or lack of success, can remind us that you aren't incompetent. They are just as good as you are, or their armor class. Their armor soaks the arrow; it just doesn't penetrate. You put the arrow right on the goblin, right smack in his chest. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to be affected by it. We can make some assumptions the arrow didn't penetrate the armor, right? So there's many ways to go about dealing with failed D20 checks in combat for sure, right? For sure. All right, everybody out there, have a great week. I don't know what we're doing this week. I'm hoping we're doing Joth. It'd be nice to get back to that old school OSC D20. I've enjoyed immensely the Dark Age of Man Chronicles with Sam and Dell. And at some point, probably not this week, we'll get back to Symbaroum. Maybe we will. We might be able to get back to Symbaroum this week. We'll see. Okay. Everybody have a wonderful week. Goodbye.